Hi, my name's Michelle. I'm a front-end developer at Bristol agency Atomic Smash. And today I want to talk about one of my favorite things in CSS, and that's custom properties. I spend a lot of my spare time making demos and tinkering with CSS, and in nearly all my demos, I find myself using custom properties these days. I'm finding new use cases for them all the time, and I have a lot of fun working with them. So I want to share some of those use cases with you today. You may have heard of custom properties referred to as CSS variables because they allow you to store values for reuse in your style sheets. Before I go any further, just a heads up that if you want to ask any questions, you can use the Q&A button, the Q&A feature on the Zoom chat, and I can pick those up at the end. Cool, so I will continue. So you may have heard of custom properties, referred to as CSS variables. They allow you to store values for reuse in your style sheets. If you're not too familiar with custom properties, this is a quick recap of the syntax. So here we're defining a custom property or variable called primary color on the root element, making it a global variable that we can use anywhere in our style sheet. And the value of our custom property is deep pink, the CSS named color. And then we can use that custom property inside a selector to apply our predefined value as the background color of this square, say. Can everyone see my screen at the moment? Sorry, I'm not 100% sure if this is screen sharing correctly. I'm just going to go back to the Zoom chat. Cool, okay, no one can see my screen, awesome. I will fix that, thank you. Oops, sorry about the technical issues, everyone. Okay, can everyone see my screen now? Hooray, awesome, thank you. So just a quick recap of the custom property syntax if you're not too familiar with them. So here we're defining a custom property or variable, which we'll call primary color on the root element. So that's the equivalent to the HTML element, but with higher specificity. And that makes it a global variable that we can use anywhere in our style sheet. And the value of our custom property is deep pink, the CSS named color. And then we can use that custom property inside a selector to apply our predefined value as the background color of this square, say, or anywhere else we might want to use it. And we can also provide a default value if we choose to, in case there's a possibility that we're using the custom property before it's been defined. So if we've previously defined the custom property like we have here, then our box is going to be deep pink. But if we haven't defined it yet, then it's going to fall back to the default value, so dark orchid as the background color. Browsers that don't support custom properties won't recognize that background color as a valid property value. So one way we could handle that is to set a valid background color higher up in our selector and allow the browser to ignore the second rule if it doesn't support it. So for IE 11, which doesn't support custom properties, this box is going to be deep pink because it doesn't recognize that second background color rule, which has a custom property. But if we don't include a fallback value higher up and the browser doesn't support custom properties, then the background color will fall back to its initial value, which is transparent. So the default is meaningless if the browser doesn't understand it, which maybe goes without saying. But if we have a nice, lovely browser like Firefox or Chrome or pretty much any modern browser, which does support custom properties, and you put some kind of nonsensical value in there, like 300 for a background color fallback value, that makes no sense as a background color value. So it will fall back to the initial value, which is again transparent. So even though we set the background color value higher up in our selector. So again, this element will be transparent. So that's maybe something to watch out for. Of course, we've been able to use variables for quite a long time in SAS and other preprocessor languages. But what makes custom properties different is that they're dynamic variables, and they can be updated in your CSS and JavaScript. The preprocessor variables are compiled into regular CSS property values before your code hits the browser. The browser will never know what is and isn't a variable, but custom properties are computed in the browser, and that has implications for how we can use them. So let's first of all look at a simple use case, and that's repeating values, which is perhaps the most obvious use case for custom properties. So anywhere you need to update a value that's repeated throughout your code, and that could be a shorthand property value, for example. So suppose you have two elements that have different top padding values, but the same padding for the three remaining sides. And at different breakpoints, we need to adjust the padding of the three remaining sides identically across both elements. So that ends up being quite a lot of code to write, but there are quite a lot of repeating values in there. And we could replace those identical values with a custom property, which I'm calling pad. And that way, we only need to change one value within our media query, and both the values for both elements will be updated everywhere we're using that custom property. And we could do that for multiple breakpoints if we needed to. And it's pretty useful too for vendor prefixes, especially for long values. For example, clip path still needs to be prefixed in some browsers. So if you have a really long clip path value, like this polygon or something even more complex, then it's kind of a pain if every time you need to make a bit of an adjustment to that value, you need to update it in two places. But if we set that as a custom property, then we just have one place to update that clip path value. In the examples so far, I'm defining the custom property on the root element, so it's a global variable. But you can also scope a custom property to a selector, and we'll look at some reasons to do that a little later on. But defining global variables can be a good idea if they're part of a design system, say. So if they're global values that we need to use repeatedly across different components. It's becoming really popular for websites to have a dark theme, and using custom properties makes it quite easy to implement this. So this is how I do it on my own website. I have all my colors set as custom properties. And then I use the prefers color scheme media query to redefine those variables for dark mode. So prefers color scheme is a relatively new media query that basically checks for whether your user's system preferences are for dark or light mode, or the other value is no preference. And you can tailor your CSS styles to any one of those. So I don't have to change all of my variables because some of them, like the primary brand color and header color, will remain the same. So I just have to change these 5 custom properties within the media query, and that's my dark mode implemented right across the site. But I do have to be quite careful about naming them. So my instinct is to name the variables things like BG light or BG dark for the background color. But of course, when we switch to dark mode, we don't really want a value for BG light that's actually a dark color. That would just be too confusing. So you kind of have to be a little bit careful about how you name things. I've kind of come up with something that works for me, which is fine. It's only me that has to maintain my site. But of course, if you need to, if you want to implement this strategy more widely as part of a team, you probably want to have a discussion about naming your variables. So we could do a really similar thing for color theming. So the default theme is deep pink, which we set on the root element. And I'm using this custom property, which is called color, to set the background color, the heading color, and the text, some of the link and button colors. So that's the example on the left. And in the second example, I'm redefining that custom property to a new value, so dark orchid. And that updates every instance where it's used. The only difference between these two color schemes is that single custom property. I don't have to change anything else. So custom properties can make implementing multiple color themes really straightforward. The main drawback actually, and the reason that I don't tend to use them for this very often is because of browser support. So clients tend to not, in my experience, not want to compromise on their color schemes, even for like older browsers like IE 11. So usually I need to provide a fallback for that. And if you have to provide a fallback, then it's kind of not worth implementing the custom properties in these ways to start with. But there are polyfills available. Again, I haven't used that in production, but it's something that I'm quite keen to explore further because it would mean being able to use custom properties a lot more widely. Another reason for global variables might be in order to maintain vertical rhythm and consistent spacing on your website. So we could set a custom property for one vertical spacing unit. So we're going to call this vertical rhythm custom property VR and set its value as 2 rems. So these highlighted margins are each one VR unit. So in this case, 2 rems. And then these 2 spaces are 2 times our vertical spacing unit. So we can use calc for that. And we can implement this quite easily with the lobotomized owl selector, which is a term coined by Hayden Pickering. So it uses the adjacent sibling combinator. Basically says that any element that follows another element should have a standard top margin with a value of 1 VR unit, so 2 rems. But for some elements, we'll override that and give them a top margin of a multiple of a VR unit. So here we're saying any H2 that follows another element should have a top margin of 2 times our VR unit. And perhaps we want that space to scale at different breakpoints, so we give elements a bit more breathing room on larger screens by increasing the white space. So where we're setting that custom property, we could specify that at a certain breakpoint, we want to increase that VR unit across the whole site. So we go from 1 rems to 2 rems. So the large spaces will always be twice the width of the smaller ones, no matter what our screen size. And we only need that one media query. We only need to adjust the custom property in that one place. And for even more consistency, we could abstract that calc value into another custom property if we find we're reusing it a lot in our code. We don't need to recalculate that 2VR variable in a media query because that's going to be automatically updated for us because it's calculated using the VR custom property, which we're already updating. So we can calculate custom property values from other custom properties, which can be very useful. One example that's already been written and talked about quite a bit is color. So I really like using HSL when I'm working with custom properties, and that stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this one because it's already fairly widely documented. But setting variables for each of the values in HSL gives you quite a fine degree of control over color. So in this example, I'm using a custom property for the hue value. I'm setting the hue value as 3 degrees, which corresponds to a red hue. And then I'm setting the second custom property, hue 2, which I'm calculating as the original hue plus 180 degrees. So that corresponds to a hue value from the opposite side of the color wheel, which gives us a complementary color pair. So we could create a bunch of color pairings and adjust them as much as we want just by tweaking that one original hue value. The secondary color will always respond and be the exact same number of degrees from the first. We don't need to calculate that second color every time. So this is in fact a single div illustration of a color wheel, which I made using only CSS gradients, so conic gradients in particular, and the mask image property. And the reason I'm showing you this is because it actually uses custom properties in a really similar way to determine the hue value for each segment in the illustration. So each segment is 30 degrees, which we can set as a custom property. And each gradient stop is calculated as a multiple of that custom property. So the first segment is that original segment value times 2, which gives us the orange segment. The yellow segment is that segment value times 3, and so on. So what we're doing here is setting custom properties that are relative to one another. And that doesn't have to apply just to color. So here's a demo I made a little while ago that uses 2 clip paths. And with an overlay, you can see those 2 clip paths a bit more easily. The second clip path needs to be offset from the first by the same amount in 2 places. So we have 2 x values for our clip path that are separated by the same amount at the top and at the bottom. Now, without custom properties, if I update one path, then I have to work out the revised path for the other, which starts to be a bit of a headache. But we can set some custom properties for those variables. So we're setting variables for the x-axis value where we want to clip the elements at the top and at the bottom, and the offset value, which is half of the distance between the 2 paths. And then we calculate the x value of the second path relative to the first, and have that update automatically whenever I adjust one of those x-axis values. If we want to change the position of the clip path, or if we want to have a bigger gap between them, then all we need to do is change the custom property. We don't need to update the clip path property at all. So if you want to have a look more into that demo, there is a link at the bottom of the slide, and I will share my slides after this talk as well. So far, we've talked about using globally scoped custom properties, but in the last couple of examples, you might have noticed that we're scoping them to a selector. And there are plenty of cases when that's more useful. One reason you might want to do that is to avoid a naming clash, which might mean a selector inadvertently inherits a custom property value that you've set on an ancestor. So personally, I find it helpful to set custom properties as close as possible to the point I'm using them. Setting a custom property on a selector means it's inherited by its descendants. There are also possible performance issues with using a lot of custom properties on the root element. So updating a custom property will cause a style recalculation of its descendants. So setting them only where you need to use them is kind of preferable. Personally, I haven't encountered any performance issues with using a lot of custom properties in this way, but then in most cases, I'm not using tons and tons of them, and I'm not updating them frequently. And I think that's mostly where you're going to get performance issues, is if you're updating them a lot with CSS or with JavaScript, maybe running animations, that kind of thing. So yeah, it's just something to watch out for. So an example of setting a custom property locally is a layout class. So here we're setting a custom property called cols for the number of columns in a grid layout. And then I'm updating it within the media query to avoid having to write out that entire grid template columns declaration again. Cols doesn't need to be a global variable because it only applies to our grid. And it means that if we have another layout class somewhere else in our code, then we're free to use that same variable again without worrying about it being inherited by some descendants. I like to use custom properties quite a lot with grid layout, and one reason is because I sometimes work with quite complex grids, and I find that using custom properties can make them more maintainable. So this is a screenshot for a website that I worked on a couple of years ago for Warner Brothers Studios, and it was one of the first sites I built with CSS Grid. The design used several different grids across the site, and these components in particular used a 24-column grid, and there were like 9 or 10 different variants with the image and the text positioned slightly differently for each one. With the Firefox Grid Inspector turned on, you can see that 24-column grid. And like I say, there were multiple variants. So these are just 2 of the variants. You can see how those images and text are positioned differently on the columns. Now you can see the code where I'm defining my grid is fairly complex. I'm not going to go right into it here, but I'm using named grid lines, I'm using min-max functions, repeated columns, lots of different units. It's not necessarily the easiest to read, but using custom properties, we can define the important values at the top of the selector and replace some of those values in our grid template columns and grid template rows declarations. And I find that makes the grid easier to understand to somebody new to it, or if you're coming back to it after a while. And the other reason I like to use custom properties with grid is because they have a very similar level of browser support. So it basically means if you're testing for one, you're testing for both. I can't think of any browsers that support one and not the other. I could be wrong about that, but I'm fairly sure that that's the case. And in fact, all modern browsers really support grid and custom properties these days. It's only the old ones we need to worry about. So you can test for support using feature queries like this. So this code says that if the browser supports custom properties, then the code inside the @supports block will be executed. So basically, if you want to provide a fallback for browsers that don't support custom properties, you can do it outside of this @supports block, and then your code for browsers that do support it can go inside the @supports block here. As I touched upon with colors, using calc with custom properties opens up a whole new world of excitement. So one place you can have a lot of fun with custom properties is with staggered animations. So suppose we have a group of elements and we want them to animate in, but we want a slight delay between the start of each element's animation to create a staggered effect. We can use custom properties to achieve this. So first we assign each element a custom property that corresponds to the element's index. And we don't need to assign the first one because we can use a default value, which if you remember, it will fall back to if the variable isn't yet defined. And then we can use calc to calculate the delay between each one and assign it to its own custom property. And then we can use that in place of our animation delay value in the shorthand property. So if you're working with lists or any kind of UI where you have groups of similar elements, then using an element's index as a custom property can be really handy. Just to digress from the animation angle for a moment, we can use a similar technique to visualize progress, which is something I did on a recent project. I needed to build a UI with a series of steps showing the customer journey. And at the top of each step is a little bar to indicate the step's position relative to the total number of steps. So if you were at step 5 out of 10, the little progress bar would be 50% filled. So I gave each list item a custom property that corresponds to its index in the list. And the whole list has a custom property that corresponds to the length of the list or the number of items. Now in this case, I'm setting that in the HTML rather than in the CSS. And the advantage of this is if you're using a templating language, then you can set the custom property within a loop. So if you're looping over items, you can use the loop index. I use Twig and Nunjucks for work, but most templating languages will give you a way to do this. And of course, if you're using React or a JavaScript framework, then it's easy to get that index value. There are different ways you could style up that progress bar, but the way I'm doing it is by using a linear gradient background with hard color stops. So in the CSS, I calculated the gradient stop as a percentage using the length and item index custom properties. So this is step 2 out of 5. So that progress bar will be 2/5 filled. So armed with the custom property that matches the element's index, we can get even more creative, especially with text. In order to implement a staggered animation for a string of text, we need to wrap each individual letter in a span and assign it to a custom property, which if we prefer, we can do within the HTML itself, just like in the previous example. And then we can implement the animation in the same way as before by calculating the delay variable. So in this case, the keyframe animation is animating the font weight of a variable font, but the technique is exactly the same as our simple box staggered animation before. Just a warning, there are accessibility implications with wrapping each letter in a span, as some screen readers won't read that H1 as a whole word, and instead they'll announce every letter individually. So you need to make sure you account for that, which you can do using ARIA label, ARIA labeled by, or a visually hidden element with the original text. There are advantages and disadvantages of each approach, but the main thing is you do one of them. It's certainly better than leaving your text inaccessible. Now, if you feel like setting a custom property on every element could get a little laborious, there's a JS library called Splitting.js that does that work for you. And that's in fact what I used for the variable font demo. It's pretty much my favorite JS library for using in demos. It also provides you with a custom property for the length of the text string too, which as we saw in the progress bar example, we sometimes need that. So let's look at a few examples of how we can use these. I really love playing around with CSS motion path. The motion path specification enables us to place elements along a path and to animate them along that path. Just a warning, there is quite a lot of motion in the next section. So if you're somebody who suffers from motion sickness or vestibular disorders, you might want to skip over this part or proceed with caution. So to use motion path, we need two properties. First of all is offset path, which we use to define our path, and offset distance to specify how far along the path to place an element. So for offset path, we give it a path value very similar to SVG path syntax. So that's how I get my paths. I draw them as SVGs in a graphics program like Illustrator, and then copy the resulting path D attribute. Now an offset distance value of 0 would place an element at the start of the path. And then we can animate the offset distance property value, which I'm doing in a keyframe animation here. So that's going to give us this little ball sliding up and down the curve. So it's a fairly simple animation, but kind of cool that we can do that just with CSS. Now the name motion path is a little misleading as it doesn't necessarily have to relate just to motion. We can position stationary elements along the path if we choose to. So if we want to position several elements equidistantly along the path, then custom properties are great for that. So again, we're calculating that offset distance value for each element using the element's index as a custom property. And we can even do it with text. So this works best with uppercase text or a monospace font, or at least a font where each character has a very similar width. Otherwise, the spacing can get kind of weird. And if we want to get even more clever about it, we can ensure that our text is always positioned along the full length of the path. So we do that by calculating the position of each character based on the custom property that corresponds to the length of the text string. And again, Splitting.js provides us with that, with this custom property. So we could position our text around a circle using offset path, for instance. And we could, of course, place text around a circle using transforms, but the difference here is the text remains selectable, which is pretty cool. So we're dividing the path length by the number of characters plus 1, which is in case we want a space after our text ends. And that gives us the offset value for each character. And then in our offset distance property, we can multiply that by the character index and use that for our offset distance property value. So that means that even if we change the length of our text, it will still fit the circle. So that's a static text example, but we can animate the text along the path too. So here our keyframe animation is moving each character along 12 rems from its original position, which is calculated with the custom property. And that gives us this result. So that's okay, but it's not terribly exciting just yet. But we could also add a small delay to each character using the same technique as the staggered animation before. And that gives our animation a much more fluid, organic feel, which I think feels a lot nicer. And of course, we can get even more creative with our paths and the properties we animate. But this demo is using exactly the same techniques, nothing more advanced than that. It's just got a slightly more complex path, and it has the addition of a color change in the middle. And this one's pretty similar, but with the addition of a 3D transform. But you can get pretty complex with custom properties if you want to and calculate a bunch of things. So in the following demo, I have these 12 custom properties, some of which are calculated from others. So this is one of the more complex demos, and those custom properties are computing the values for the delay, color, 3D transform rotation value, and the position along the path using offset distance, and the animation duration of each of those individual segments. There is a tiny bit of JavaScript with this demo, which is just being used to start and stop the animation. But apart from that, it's all CSS using custom properties. So there's really no limit to how creative you can get if you use your imagination and if you like doing maths, which apparently I do. Now, we can use custom properties to make our code more concise by controlling several different CSS property values at once. This is a technique pioneered by Anna Tudor, which she calls dry state switching. And Leah Faroux has also recently written about a kind of similar, but sort of slightly different technique. And it involves toggling a single custom property on or off using a value of 0 or 1. So we set the custom property, first of all, as 0, so the off value. And then we use it with calc wherever we want to change a value in our CSS. So if we take the border radius as our first example, then the custom property value, it will be multiplied by 50% in that calc function, and that will equal 0. So this square will have a border radius of 0. Now I'm doing a kind of similar thing in the transform, rotate and skew values too. So we just get this square first of all when our custom property is off. But if we switch that custom property value to 1, so the on value, then the border radius will be 50% because that calc value will be 1 times 50%. And it's a similar thing for the transform values too. So we get quite a different shape just by toggling one custom property. So the difference between these two shapes is one custom property, but it changes multiple values. And Anna Tudor has written much more extensively about this technique in her articles for CSS tricks. So they're definitely worth reading. And that includes using it to switch things like color values and animation states, which at first glance you might not think would be applicable. So for these two elements, quite a lot of things are different. One is animating, the other one is not, so both have different gradients, but they're all controlled using just one single custom property, which we're toggling on and off. Now, I'm not necessarily advocating for you to do this in your code base. It might not be practical, but there could be instances where it makes sense to do this, something like this in your code. On the other hand, it might make your code a bit too opaque and actually isn't worth the effort of all those calculations. But I think it's interesting that custom properties allow us to perform something like logical operations in CSS. We can also manipulate custom property values with JavaScript. So this is a tool I built for generating zigzag gradient backgrounds. So whenever the user moves one of these sliders, it changes one of the custom properties, which I'm using to set the thickness of the stripes, the angle, and the width of the zigzags. And although we can't use animations and transitions on CSS gradients, we can transition custom properties using Houdini. So Houdini is a set of APIs that allow developers to extend CSS. So I register the property in JavaScript, You need to register 4 things. We've got the name, which we're calling angle, the syntax. So in this case, it would be the angle syntax if it's controlling the angle, but there are lots of different values that you can have for that. So you can have color, length, various other ones. We specify whether it inherits, and we also need to specify an initial value, which we're setting as 40 degrees. And it's really important that we specify that, otherwise it won't work. And then I can transition that custom property just like any other CSS transition property, which makes the whole thing feel a bit smoother. So that's another bonus you get with custom properties, although it's not supported in all browsers. So again, just to show you that demo, I'm also using the same technique to transition the stripe thickness and width as well as the angle. So it just feels a little bit smoother than if I didn't have those transitions on. Now from Chrome version 85, you can also register the property in CSS instead and transition it in the same way. So you don't actually have to register it in JavaScript at all. Kind of cool. Now we can also set custom properties in JavaScript. So this is a demo where every letter is animated in at random. Now I'm looping over the characters and assigning each one a randomized custom property using this getRandom function. And then I'm using it just like the staggered animation examples we've already seen, so that the letters animate in randomly rather than sequentially. So set the custom property in JavaScript, we use element dot style set property, and then we pass in the property name and the value that you want to set it as. So I hope this has given you a bit of a glimpse into custom properties and left you feeling a little bit inspired to play around with them and build some fun things. If you'd like some more resources to get started, then Leah Varu recently wrote a great introduction to custom properties. Una Kravitz has a really good write-up using HSL, the color function, and custom properties for color theming. And I've written about some of the techniques used here on my blog, CSS in Real Life. So thank you for listening. You can also find me on Twitter at NicheBarks or at CSS in Real Life if you just want some of the CSS stuff and not the life stuff. And a big thank you to Bath Digital Festival for having me and all of the sponsors too. So I'm gonna jump over to the chat and see if anyone has any questions. Just bear with me. Cool, so we have a couple of questions from Oscar. So the first one is, I'm not sure, Oscar, whether you're asking why I use a preprocessor like Sass or why I don't use a preprocessor. So I actually do use Sass as well. I tend to use Sass variables for a lot of the kind of fixed values. So one of them is breakpoints. So in fact, with custom properties, you can't use those in like media query declarations, for instance. They can only be used in CSS property values. So I still need my Sass variables. I still use Sass for things like nesting. Also, I really like Sass's color functions where you can lighten or darken things. You can't do that quite as easily with custom properties. You can do it if you use like HSL and set variables for each of them. It really depends. It depends on what I'm building. So sometimes I prefer to do it that way. Sometimes I prefer to do it in Sass. But yeah, I'm definitely not like advocating for abandoning Sass, because Sass still has a lot of great features that I use all the time. So Oscar, you're also asking, so variable controls seems simpler and easier than using it. So yeah, in some ways it definitely is. I think, yeah, it's important not to think about them as like a total replacement for one another. So as I mentioned earlier, CSS variables are dynamic variables. So if you want to be able to control a lot of things with just one variable, so you just want to update it and have everything update, then yep, CSS variables are great for that. But yeah, sometimes you just want to have some fixed variables that don't change. So yeah, I still do use those SAS variables quite a bit. Cool, I'm not sure if there are any other questions. Thank you. Let me just have a quick check. I think there might be some things in the chat. Cool, okay, well, I think that's everything. So thank you for having me. I will share my slides on Twitter and with the Bath Digital Festival, so look out for those. And yeah, feel free to get in touch if you have any more questions. Always happy to talk about custom properties and CSS in general. So thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the festival.